Hello, I'm Korin Davis, Director of Academic Programs at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Welcome to Equitable Growth 2021, People and Research Advancing Economic Evidence, this year's installment of our biennial grantee conference. 2020 was a difficult year. The country is facing multiple overlapping crises, the ongoing public health emergency and the subsequent recession, as well as unrest over systemic racial inequities and the urgency of climate change. But the effects are not borne equally across our country or our economy. These crises fall disproportionately on Black and Latinx families and put the people who can least afford it on the front lines, low-wage and hourly workers, and small and medium-sized businesses. It is moments like these that Equitable Growth was built for. Our mission is to advance evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. Founded in 2013, we've grown from a tiny 6-person staff to a team of 46, an inaugural grantee class of 27 scholars in 2014 to a collaborative network of 300 academics. As you may have seen, Equitable Growth's president and CEO, Heather Boucher, was recently named as appointee to President-elect Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. She is looking forward to hearing from you during the conference, but otherwise is unable to provide formal remarks due to the appointment. At the heart of our organization is academic programming and grant making. We believe that research can affect real change when put into the hands of those with the power to act. Therefore, our academic engagement with you is about much more than financial support. We are committed to providing resources and opportunities for scholars to elevate their research findings to reach other scholars and beyond the academy. And that is why we are so excited about this conference. We have a great lineup of paper sessions. For presenters, we hope you find that your research is improved by the feedback you receive. And for attendees, we hope you learn about cutting-edge new research that will inform your work and uncover connections across disciplines and subfields. In addition to paper sessions, we are also offering 2 trainings that we hope you'll take advantage of. One on working with policymakers and one on working with the media. We're excited to have a bipartisan group of congressional staffers joining us for the policy training, and an expert who works at the intersection of academia and journalism leading the media training. While the virtual setting gives us flexibility we wouldn't normally have, nothing replaces the informal but often extremely fruitful conversations that happen in person. We've worked to address that through a series of salons. These short, frank conversations cover tips for accessing administrative data, opportunities for public service for academics, navigating the academic job market, resources for teaching online undergraduate coursework on inequality, and importantly, 2 salons on mentorship to promote inclusion within the social sciences. The national reckoning on race is also reflected in the reckoning that is happening within academia as it faces its own history of exclusion. For too long, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been systemically overlooked and excluded, and research at the intersection of race and power has been seen as secondary to the core work. Equitable Growth continues to work to support greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in the social sciences. Our 2021 request for proposals emphasizes research questions on structural racism. And through our doctoral grants and dissertation scholars program, we seek to support students from underrepresented groups with financial and professional development support. We also believe that mentorship is an important component to building more diversity and inclusion in academia. But this, of course, we cannot do alone. We hope you will try to attend one of the mentorship salons on offer and work with us in the coming years as we try to connect early career scholars with mentorship opportunities. As you can probably tell, we're very excited about the conference we put together for you. I want to thank all my colleagues who worked tirelessly to put the conference together, particularly Christian Edlogin, Natalie Antandi, Sanjay Supan, Aixa Alman-Diaz, Maria Monroe, Dave Evans, Tyjon Conley, Shonda Williams, Erica Hanloff, as well as Equitable Growth Leadership, all of our program leads who will be chairing paper sessions, and staff from across the organization who will be there to help support our speakers with logistical and technical support. But now, let me introduce my colleague, Greg Leiserson. Greg is Director of Tax Policy and Chief Economist at Equitable Growth. His research focuses on the economics of tax, social insurance, and retirement policies. Prior to joining Equitable Growth, He served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors and as an economist in the US Treasury's Office of Tax Analysis. He holds a PhD from MIT. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the conference.
Well, thank you, Korin, and thank you everybody for joining us today for Equitable Growth 2021, People and Research Advancing Economic Evidence. To kick us off, I am pleased to welcome Atif Mian for a conversation about inequality and growth. Atif is the John H. Laporte Jr., class of 1967 professor of economics, public policy, and finance at Princeton University, and director of the Julius Rabinovitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He's also a member of Equitable Growth Steering Committee and a 2015 Equitable Growth grantee. Professor Mian's research examines the connections between finance and the macroeconomy and is published in numerous academic journals. He is also the author of the critically acclaimed book, House of Debt, with Amir Sufi. We'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. A few quick programming notes at the outset. First, as Korin had mentioned, we had hoped for Heather Boucher to host this conversation, but due to her appointment to President-elect Biden's Council of Economic Advisors, we weren't able to make that happen. Second, this session is on the record. We encourage you to tweet, share, and discuss. On social media, you can join the conversation using the hashtags EGGrantee and EG2021. For the social media handles for participants in this session, you can go to bit.ly/EG2021_SN. Again, that's bit.ly/EG2021_SN. We'll be sharing highlights from this and other on-the-record sessions throughout the conference from our handle @Equitable Growth, and we encourage you to follow along there and to participate in the conversations. With that, let's jump in. So Atif, your recent work explores the relationship between income and wealth inequality, low interest rates, and the policies that can spur growth. So if you could walk us through this research. What is the connection between inequality and interest rates that you're studying? And what does that mean for the strength of our economy?
Thanks, Greg and the Equitable Growth for having me. Let me take a step back and give the bigger picture as I see it. And especially since this is sort of the lead session for a number of exciting and the future of academia really in terms of the researchers, I want to sort of put in context what I feel is one of the most interesting questions out there. So maybe there are many others who can sort of advance this field. I think one problem we have, given the way we do work, is that we pay a lot of attention to stuff that is happening day to day. So, you know, if there is a new crisis emerging in terms of some bank failure and so on, that naturally gets a lot of attention because that's how the news cycle works. The flip side of that is that what often gets overlooked are strong, very persistent forces that are working at a slower frequency in the background. And I think the way we typically give importance to questions is a bit biased towards the shorter run questions, the questions that have, you know, more flash in the pan kind of an effect to them. And so this sort of reminds me of this tale that a lot of us have heard before of this frog who's sitting in sort of a pot of water that is getting warmed up gradually, but the frog does not realize what is happening to him until it's too late, and it's too late to jump off the boiling water, and the frog kind of dies in the process. I take that analogy to economics in terms of these slow-moving forces that are often working in the background, which are very important. This is what we call structural forces. They don't necessarily affect us from day to day, but their effect accumulates over time. And I think those are some of the very interesting questions before us right now is how can we best understand these slow moving but very deep forces that impact in a very fundamental way how the economy works. I think that's a serious challenge because it's harder to address those questions from the usual tools of economics that we are familiar with, like take the usual empirical tools, difference and differences, that sort of stuff. Those tools are more amenable to answering, again, the short-term questions, but it's becomes more difficult to use the same tools to answer some of these longer lasting questions that I was referring to earlier. So that's sort of the context in which I would like to place the conversation, and also to encourage the scholars out there to really try to attack these, in some sense, the more fundamental questions which are out there. So now let me give one example of the question which gets closer to the question that you raised. What I have been fascinated with is the longer term consequences of this persistent rise in inequality that we have seen, not just in the US, but globally across almost every advanced country in the world. And the other aspect of this inequality that is useful to keep in mind is that this is not just inequality in like a Gini coefficient sense. The rise in inequality that we are talking about is really the rise of inequality driven by the share of income going to the very top. So think of the top 1% to be more precise. What happens when the share of the economy going to this thin slice of the population rises higher and higher over a long period of time, 30, 40 years or so? What consequences does that have for the overall economy? So that's the fundamental question that I'm very much interested in. And in terms of the initial implications that come out of this sort of thinking, and this, by the way, goes, I'm referring to my recent work with Amir Sufi and Ludwig Straub at Harvard. What we think is important to understand is that the top 1% are very different from the rest of the population in one very important way. And that is that they save a much higher fraction of their lifetime income relative to the rest of the population. So a natural consequence of rising top income inequality is that you're going to have a rise in gross savings in the economy. This is something that we refer to as saving glut of the rich. And you see that very clearly in the data. So the rise in top income inequality has been accompanied by this rise in saving glut of the rich. Now, in general, the way we write our macro models, you would say this is in fact a great thing, because everyone loves savings as a macroeconomist, because we know savings equals investments. The only problem is that that's actually not true. Saving does not have to equal investment. And so what we have seen actually is that while we have had this rise in saving at the top end, what I'm calling the saving glut of the rich, if you look at investment actually has not risen at all. In fact, investment to GDP, if anything, has declined over this time period somewhat. So that raises the obvious question: if we have more savings at the very top, where are those savings going? And that's where the financial sector comes in, and it's very important to understand the role of finance in that context. What is happening at sort of this macro financial level is that those additional savings are not going into investment. I've already talked about that. But instead, what has to happen at the macro level then is those savings have to be absorbed as dissaving by the rest of the population. Otherwise, there's going to be this fall in aggregate demand. As people know quite well, you fall into what is referred to as a liquidity trap and the problems associated with that. So coming back to the path from 1980 onwards, what's been happening at the macro level is that in order to absorb this ever-increasing glut of savings, driven, as I said here, by the rising inequality, the amount of dissavings required to keep aggregate demand at the same level has also grown over time, and that has been absorbed. We find in our more recent work is that has been absorbed through dissaving by the bottom 90% of the population, and that dissaving takes the form of them running down their financial assets or them borrowing more through the financial markets, essentially borrowing from the top 1% by putting as collateral, essentially housing assets by and large. So that in a nutshell is what's been happening at the macro level. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is it's very important to think of these dynamics in a general equilibrium context. And the process that I just described to you, it's only possible for this process to go on. And again, that is to say for savings at the top to rise and then facilitate this saving for the bottom 90%. The only way this can go on is if the interest rate continues to fall. Because remember, the bottom 90% are partially borrowing to sustain a higher level of consumption. And credit in the meanwhile continues to rise as a share of GDP, exactly as we have seen in the data. The only way to keep this equilibrium going is for the credit to continue to rise and for the interest rate to continue to fall. And here, the interest rate that I'm talking about is typically what's referred to as R star. It's the equilibrium long-run interest rate, if you will. And so that long-run interest rate has to continue to fall to keep this rising credit as a result of inequality sustainable. And that sort of in a nutshell is the macro dynamic. I'll just end on the punchline, which is this cannot go on forever. What I've just described to you is a fundamentally unsustainable process. And one reason for that is that R star or long-run interest rate, once it gets close to zero, we have a problem because you cannot push on that margin anymore. And that's essentially where we are. And so that then raises a number of very important policy, practical, as well as academic questions, which is what I started off by saying that I really hope that we push in terms of addressing and answering those questions.
And let's go into that a little bit further. So you've set this up in the context of long-running, 40-year trends that should be encouraging us to think about the economy differently and sort of a change in our understanding of how it works. What are some of the sort of at-scale policy implications that you think come from this new understanding of the economy? What should policymakers be looking to do, or policies that they may consider now that they wouldn't have been considering in the past?
Excellent question. Let me first, in a way, sort of talk about the other side of this question, which is, let's talk about policies that will not really work given this situation. One obvious example is monetary policy. Because when R star gets close to zero, a natural implication from monetary policy is that there is less and less room for monetary policies to do anything. But that analogy of monetary policy that people are well familiar with actually applies more broadly as well. Your policy space actually naturally becomes more and more restrictive in this world of collapsing interest rates and rising inequality and rising credit. I think that's very important to understand, because what that means is that when we do talk about what should be done, those policies may sound quote unquote more radical, but that is because you now have to finally address the structural causes of the problem that we are facing. So that's sort of one thing to keep in mind. Just to give maybe one or two other examples of policies that will not work. Like think of macroprudential policies, for example. Oh, let's lean against the wind to suppress credit from rising. If you put that in the context of kind of the macro framework that I talked about, you can right away see that those policies actually will not work, but in fact will backfire in the short run. Because if the economy is deficient of demand and it's trying to create demand through credit, if you try to push back on credit, you may be successful in doing that. However, now you're going to have an aggregate demand problem and the economy will be in danger of dipping back into recession. So that's just another example of why in this world where this slow-moving structural force that I emphasized is kind of the cause of all our problems in that framework, your policy space will become more and more restrictive. So now let me come to the other aspect of your question: what should be done, or what should be the framework within which we should guide our policy? There are a few things that come out quite naturally, again, as long as we keep our eye on the broader macro framework. The first one is I talked about savings rising, but investment has not risen. So that's one margin where policy can naturally intervene, is think of ways that will boost real investment, right? That's the kind of investment we're talking about. There are things one can do on the private sector side that have to do with competition or lack thereof and so on. I think that's one very important aspect, is to make the marketplace more competitive. But the other one is public investment. So another feature of the US macroeconomy that is very important to keep in mind is that throughout this process, public investment as a share of GDP has actually continued to decline. And which, by the way, in the background of overall federal outlays have not declined as a share of GDP, but the share of public investment within those outlays has declined significantly. And that causes real problems in terms of both long-run growth as well as what I was referring to earlier, which is the productive absorption of these savings. Relatedly, when we think of public investment, so public investment has to rise, right? And some of the plans obviously go in that direction, and that's the right approach. But the other aspect of public investment that one needs to keep an eye on is that they cannot just be any public investment projects. The public investment projects have to be such that the returns to those those investments largely fall on the bottom 90%, that they benefit most from it. And that's a very important constraint to keep in mind. It should really guide the design of these policies, both in terms of how it is carried through. So for example, the value added should not be captured by, let's say, private equity firms and things of that sort. So it should be competitive. That's another way of saying that. But then also the returns from that investment have to be very broad-based. And so that really, one has to think through that problem very, very carefully. So that's one aspect that's very important. The other aspect that's very important is, I've already talked about that inequality is making the entire system fundamentally unbalanced. And as a result of that, fundamentally unsustainable, really. That's another way of framing everything that I talked about earlier, which is that the economy is, at the end of the day, it's an ecosystem where we are all connected through, one person's supplies, another person's demand. And when this ecosystem becomes very unbalanced, the danger is that it will start to collapse. And that's really the forces of collapse is what I was emphasizing. So on the policy side, it means that you have to think of properly designed redistributive policies that undo some of that imbalance that I just talked about. And on that, in terms of tax policy, again, in a consolidated, when you take into account, for example, direct, indirect taxes and so on, it's simply not progressive enough. And that needs to be addressed. So when I say it's not progressive enough, I'm not just talking about raising taxes. I think serious thinking should be devoted into lowering taxes for the bottom 90%, for example, because that will add to aggregate demand, given that they have a much higher propensity to spend out of lifetime income. So we need to make the taxation system more progressive by lowering as well as raising taxes at the top. But in terms of taxes at the top, I think we do need to think beyond income taxes as well. People have talked about, for example, estate taxes, inheritance taxes. That is very important because this accumulation of income ultimately also results in accumulation of wealth, which in fact has risen even more at some level. And that problem needs to be tackled as through estate taxes, inheritance taxes, but also I think the policy option of wealth taxes has to be considered seriously. I think at a conceptual level, there is sort of no doubt that given this kind of a problem, appropriately formulated wealth taxes at the very top end of the wealth distribution, they are very effective in rebalancing the economy. So that should also be on the table. Now, obviously, there's a question of political feasibility and all of that. So I'm putting all of those issues aside right now, because the first issue is identify the problem conceptually and find out the menu of options that will work best to attack that fundamental problem.
Thank you. And I should note for the audience that we will momentarily open it up for questions. So if you want to use the Ask a Question feature, the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, you can get a few questions in there to start building the queue. So Atif, I want to take this in a little bit of a different direction now. This is, of course, Equitable Growth's biennial grantee conference and a highlight of our academic programming. And as Korin mentioned at the top, we just released our 2021 request for proposals. That RFP can be found on our website. I encourage everybody to check it out and consider submitting an application. In this year's RFP, we emphasize research on structural racism to better understand the causes, consequences, and solutions to economic inequality. And so I want to pose a question to you. Are there particular questions in this area that you would like to see more work on from economists going forward?
Absolutely, but let me just give a connection of this question to the broader framework that I was talking about. This is another tragedy of sort of the rising inequality that we have seen, and not just the rising inequality, but the macro consequences of rising inequality actually make inequality more entrenched in a way that whatever structural class differences, race differences you may have, they become, or they are likely to become, more embedded, more persistent. And I think that's a very important, interesting question that I would urge people to pursue. So let me give you just one example of that. I've already emphasized how rising inequality leads to a lowering of interest rate, R star, what I was talking about. But there is another way of saying the same thing, which is a fall in long-term interest rate raises valuation ratios, raises wealth to income, if you will. Another way to say that is that for the same dollar of income, buying an asset becomes harder for you because now it is being sort of monetized or valued at a lower interest rate, lower long-run interest rate, so the value will go up. And what that means is that for people who are not endowed with those assets, so for example, their parents were not rich enough, even for the same real income that they were having or their parents were having before, now they will find it even harder to buy into those assets. So for example, home ownership becomes more and more out of reach. And that's exactly what we have seen actually over time. So one very interesting statistic on home ownership is that, first of all, despite this enormous increase in credit, guess what? Home ownership actually over the period when credit really grows has actually not changed much. It's gone up and down, but overall, there's no material change in home ownership rate. In fact, even more importantly, if you look at home ownership by generations, for the younger, like millennials and younger generation, home ownership rates are at a much lower level at the same age, at the same point in time in their life cycle, relative to home ownership rates of earlier generations like boomers and so on. So what that suggests is that this force that results from the initial inequality, the macro dynamics, again, R star is one way of summarizing all of that, that has feedback implications for rising wealth inequality and rising lack of intergenerational mobility that obviously affects all of the existing fractures that you have in the society, including fractures along racial and other lines. So that it's a fascinating question, and I really hope people would pursue it.
All right, thank you. And so we have just a few minutes here for questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and use the Ask a Question Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we can pose some of those questions to Atif. So while we wait to see if we have any questions from the audience, let me propose one sort of additional follow-up research question for you in the space of sort of lifting up one level from where we were in the policy conversation before. You've sort of talked about in other settings the challenge of inequitable growth. We've got the specific challenges associated with the distribution of wealth and the need for public investment. If you were giving policymakers advice about what they should do writ large to promote equitable growth more broadly, what are some of the other policies you might propose in that space?
As in terms of long-run growth, what is important, the factors that are important, the first one is investment, obviously, and investment in factors that are more and more relevant for long-run growth in sort of the new economy. And so those factors are sort of early education investment, for example, making sure that the population at large has equal access to quality education and early enough in life, that the educational investment that is being pursued is on modern lines in terms of people are getting kind of the tools that are required in this new economy, and the importance of science and technology is obvious in there. So that's number one. But the other, which may be more relevant from a regulatory perspective, is that it's very important to make sure that there is a level playing field. And what has happened along with rising inequality, unfortunately, is that the playing field has become less equal over time. We see this in the form of rise in in sort of monopoly power or a fall in competition over time. And more market power is not good for investment. It's not good for inequality, obviously, and it's also not good for rising wages because more and more of the value added goes into profits if you have greater monopolization of the economy. So I think from a regulatory perspective, it's very important that we think seriously about the lack of competition or rising market power, specifically in certain sectors of the economy, in certain industries. And so that issue, which was once addressed with the breakup of AT&T and other big players, I mean, I think that's a very important question that should be front and center in terms of policy.
So I think we'll close out here with one question from the audience. What is the role of climate change in the long-term growth dynamics you've identified here about wealth and the interest rates, the perpetuation of wealth over time? How should we be thinking about climate change as we think about all of these issues?
Climate change is not sort of my area of expertise, so it's not, and it's obviously a very important question, especially from a long-run perspective. So I don't have, I guess, any deep insight relative to many other experts in this area. I will say one thing, though, which is from what we know, in fact, COVID is kind of one example of that. From what we know in terms of natural crises like COVID, is that they radically exacerbate existing inequality and existing inequities. And so all of these issues that are resulting from rise of inequality and sort of the instability, the fundamental instability that comes about as a result of that, in the event of climate change and the consequences of that, whether it's in the form of pandemics, whether it's in the form of flooding, whether it's in the form of droughts and so on, we know that disproportionately is going to impact the bottom 90, the bottom 50% of the population. And what that means is it just continues to make the problem worse and worse. And again, COVID-19 crisis is just a perfect example of that we have had to load up even more on sort of the public sector to create demand to solve this problem, precisely because we did not have the space to use the other standard policy tools that we have, like monetary policy being the obvious example. So I think that those problems will continue to exacerbate if we don't address, in addition to the structural imbalance of the economy, if we don't address sort of this other macro level issue, which is climate change.
Well, that's all of the time we have. Thank you very much, Atif Mian, for joining us for this conversation. And thank you, everybody who is attending the conference today and attending for this session. Our first set of concurrent sessions will begin at 2 p.m. and I look forward to joining all of you there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg.